Hello, Jeanette.
Hello.
Hello, good afternoon. You're in the UK, so there's no time difference. It's great.
Yeah, it's great.
Now, today we wanted to have or to record a chat about a fairly hot topic, and this topic is to do with the destruction of monuments. And with that in mind, because of the nature of the topic, I just wanted just to read a very brief statement that we wrote sort of yesterday. They're saying, in recent days, there has been much talk surrounding the destruction and removal of so-called historic monuments. Some suggest that such monuments are the very epitome of historical and cultural significance, whereas others suggest that a proper approach to such monuments reveals that they are in fact relatively new, relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of things. It is ironic, however, that, in my opinion, and I think we've both kind of come to agree that a genuine approach, historical and anthropological, to these issues reveals actually that there's an ever-present potency of such symbols, statues and architecture, and the ways in which people have always negotiated cultural boundaries, reinforcing old meanings and creating new truths through the often highly destructive treatment of monuments and architecture, and we'll touch on that, some case studies during this video. It's also worthwhile briefly just addressing an elephant in the room, just boop. First of all, I'm a Brit, you're from New York, and Archaeo-Soup in general is not hopefully the place that you would expect to find people who agree with, say, an alt-right agenda. So yes, in that sense, there is a bias in this conversation. I just want to acknowledge that. But I think we both also agreed, I know I'm doing a lot of talking for you at the moment, I think we both also agreed that would be a very boring video just to record us going, that Jew's bad, because that should be obvious. People at home.
Yeah.
And so instead, actually, I wanted to talk about, and I think we can have a good conversation here about the historical and anthropological perspective on some of the things we've been seeing. So first of all, do you want to just sort of talk a little bit about what we're talking about in that sense?
Sure. So, I guess, so the sort of articles that are coming out and the arguments that are coming out sort of in the wake of all of this, specifically about monuments, it's this sort of problem of are we erasing history or heritage by sort of quote allowing people to tear down these monuments, and there are different things going on, right? Because there's sort of the public protesting and defacing monuments and actually, pulling down statues or, painting them or shattering them. And then there's also just sort of local governments or institutions or whoever's in possession of these monuments just sort of taking action to remove them and put them somewhere else. And I would argue that both of these things are pretty culturally significant and that neither are necessarily bad. But I think it's important for us to sort of discuss the context and sort of understand why the kind of act of tearing down a symbol is sort of historically and culturally significant, not just sort of, oh no, we're getting rid of a statue, that's bad, because how else are we going to remember someone? Yeah, so...
So it's a significant act, and that's undeniable, but it's also an act that in of itself will add, in fact, to what becomes history. So in that vein of this question of erasing history, there are certain archaeologists, who shall remain nameless, we both know them, who have tried to state the case that destroying any form of monument is essentially it's offensive. Destroying history is something which we have never allowed before. Imagine what would have happened if just the Egyptians decided just to tear down the pyramid or something. And I would say actually that argument, this argument that somehow history has been handed to us in a pristine fashion, in an unscathed fashion, unscarred, is it's a willful misunderstanding of what history is. And actually, in particular, when it comes to, if you want to talk pyramids, when it comes to Egypt, Akhenaten, In the case of Akhenaten, there was a willful society-wide attempt to actually eradicate that person's name from history. His name was chiselled out of monuments. I think only one or two statues remain of him because he was smashed up. And his son, Tutankhaten originally, but Tutankhamun, he had to rename himself because of the religious upheaval, had to be buried and essentially hidden because people were still looting and destroying and wrecking stuff. They weren't concerned about passing on some sort of pristine message to the future. They were living and negotiating what history and monuments were to them in their time and in their present. And so I think some people out there, especially historians, have tried to make this argument, and I think it's a false argument. The fact that, for example, at the moment people are choosing to move statues means something, and it's a historically significant act. I mean, you love iconoclasm, don't you?
I do. That's a great word.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, people have been tearing down monuments forever, and actually, I was thinking about in terms of American history and sort of this idea of erasure. This
Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. No.
Yeah.
The Eraser. Sorry.
Yeah. No, good. A painting that I think is in possession of the New York Historical Society, which I've seen. I think I sent you an article that included this painting. It was, it's of New Yorkers tearing down a bronze statue of King George. And first of all, so even if the statue is no longer there, like obviously after the American Revolutionary War, maybe we don't want statues to King George because he is no longer our king. But I still know who King George is. Because we have these wonderful, there wasn't even photography back then, but painters have very clearly depicted, what this scene looked like, what the statue looked like. And obviously, we have writing, and we have wonderful historians and archaeologists who have sort of documented things and are continually documenting things. So,
well, and as part of that, what you end up with is the texture of history.
Right.
And so, for example, again, I'm going to bring back in some more archaeology. In the case of Rome, the history of the Forum is an astonishing history in Rome. I mean, at one point, Mussolini dynamited whole sections of that place just because at that moment in time that's what he wanted to have happen. The way in which, for example, the Vatican has sort of subsumed bits of marble from around Rome over the Renaissance, this kind of thing. But also a big one, if we're talking Renaissance in Europe, is the Reformation. The MF Reformation, when people were tearing down, reclaiming, redistributing, and destroying architecture, wealth, places of power, significant pilgrimage sites. And that's part of our history. It shaped the destination of Western civilization. Arguably, America wouldn't really exist in the shape it does were it not for the Reformation. And no one seems to sort of complain about that.
Well, I think people are focusing on the monuments themselves so much that they're kind of forgetting about the importance of the sort of context surrounding their removal. Well,
and what's interesting there, you see, is that some of those same people about 100 years ago would be turning up at like a ruined monastery and saying, "How quaint," and having a picnic. Right. It's interesting how these moments are moments, and they are always constantly being reaffirmed and renegotiated. So we find ourselves with a broad anthropological consensus that the destruction of a monument or an icon is culturally significant, and therefore that can't be denied. There's something significant happening. But I guess my mind immediately goes to a fairly important question, and that is that the destruction of an icon and its meaning is proportionately, and it correlates to the significance of the icon. If I tear up a wet handkerchief, it doesn't really mean anything. If I blow up the House of Parliament, that means something. So the question is, I suppose, authenticity. How would you describe the authenticity of these focuses of action.
Right.
These statues.
And the concept of authenticity is something that anthropologists kind of debate and struggle with and write about frequently. Anyways, in general, like how authentic really is any action or any monument. I mean, monuments are generally pretty one-sided, and they're built, they're commissioned with a purpose to sort of remember an individual's greatness or an event. So that being said, in terms of Confederate monuments in the United States, very few of them went up in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War, which makes sense if you think about it, because the Confederacy lost the war. And how often do you see the sort of losers of a military conflict erecting statues to celebrate their loss? It doesn't really make sense.
No.
So the group responsible for the majority of memorials was called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and it was a pretty influential white women's organization in the South in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and basically between like 1895 and World War II, they were sort of very quickly putting up hundreds of monuments throughout the South. Because they had this very aggressive agenda to kind of vindicate the Confederacy, and it was.
And this was presumably in the wake of essentially the destruction that the Civil War had caused.
Yes, and it was also in the wake of the Jim Crow era. I mean, it was. You can't erase it was racially motivated. A lot of this, and that's a whole other video to sort of dig deep into this. I know we're talking about monuments today.
And just to explain that briefly, though, in so much as it directly relates to segregation in the South.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
But we won't go down that rabbit hole today.
Right, no, but that that was the context that these were put up in. It wasn't put up in the context of remembering the Civil War, which is what people are sort of seem more concerned with. Those who are maybe not part of fringe groups who are still defending these monuments, staying up. So when you talk about sort of quote authenticity or legitimacy, these are not. I would not call these like authentic Civil War statues. They're not.
No. And so I suppose, I mean, the reason why I asked that sort of question is that I'm obviously from a part of the world where statues tend to be certainly older than those statues that you're describing, but they also, especially for example, when it comes to the closest equivalent I can think of in a day-to-day exposure would be memorials linked with the First World War and the Second World War, the Great War, and the fact that at places like Flanders Field in Europe, you have this tremendous monumental expression of grief, loss, hope for the future, put up as a direct response to a conflict. And what's interesting here is that I didn't know until I started looking into this that I assumed that these Confederate monuments would be in that vein, and they're not. And I can't help but wonder whether actually that's also partly what's fueling a lot of this. I'm not, not necessarily the violence that happened at Charlottesville, but certainly this conversation that's happening afterwards is essentially people just don't quite understand what those monuments are. And so in some ways, and I guess this is where this is oddly, I think we've come down another form of legitimacy here, in so much as there is actually a legitimate confusion. So destroying a monument or an icon has ripples, cultural ripples, and there is a legitimate reason for people to be confused here. But I suppose, I guess a key question here is this: when it comes back to this question of erasure of history, are any of these characters actually likely to be forgotten anyway? I mean, the people who are really up in arms about no. If you try and destroy anything, once something's up, it's part of history. If you try and take it down, that is an act of cultural editing and fingers in the ears. Are these people going to be forgotten anyway?
And I mean, I would say no, of course not. And I think if anything, it's events like this and sort of the political movements and sort of the constant flux that causes people like this actually to be remembered is sort of in a better way, to be remembered in the context in which they maybe should be remembered. There's a statue to someone sort of glorifying them. That's all that is.
Mm-hmm.
They are sort of presented without context, and I think that's how a lot of mythology gets sort of built around people, and why people sort of value monuments in certain ways. But I mentioned earlier with the King George statue.
They can have their time.
Exactly. Yeah, and the fact that the statue was there has also been documented. Mm-hmm. And then, some statues, obviously the ones that are destroyed are gone. Mm-hmm. But ones that are not destroyed, they can be moved to museums where they can be given proper context, and sort of...
Well, and also, frankly, these questions can be presented. Would it not be fascinating to go to a museum and have now an exhibition that says, what does this statue mean?
Right.
Or maybe ask someone at the beginning, get people to write a little sort of information sheet about, when do you think this was put up? Why do you think it was put up?
Yeah.
And then walk them through that. That could be an interesting exercise, certainly. But I suppose one final thing that comes to mind, though, is it possible to, at this moment, to sort of divorce ourselves? It's probably easier for me to divorce ourselves from the emotional turmoil surrounding these questions, because, for example, in recent days we've seen statues taken down overnight, for example, at the University of Texas. I can't help but come back on a certain, again, sort of linked with this question of authenticity, because it puts me in mind of when we visit, for example, the in-laws in Northern Ireland. When we're there, I am almost, I find it almost impossible not to observe the boundaries that people enact in Northern Ireland from an anthropological perspective. I sometimes almost get myself into trouble taking photos of, oh, look at that UDA flag, these sort of paramilitary groups who, and to be fair, actually, my father-in-law has been very accommodating. He goes, "Oh, there's another one." Maybe we'll turn around and
yeah, right, you've sent me many photos of the border.
Yeah, from within a car, but not obviously not standing outside. But the point is that these borders are not simple. There's not one line. They are negotiated between communities, sometimes splitting towns in two, and they are mapped. They are place bound. Whereas what we're seeing, I think, in some respects here, I can't help but wonder, to what extent is there actually a sort of a legitimate boundary, a legitimate focus of a local concern, or actually are we seeing something else, some sort of other, plane of social response?
Yeah, I think you're right that it's. I mean, there's no like juridical sort of border line. Sort of.
Yeah, well, like in Northern Ireland, you must have heard the people sort of saying, "This is our traditional route. This is where we're going to march," and their traditional route just happens to take them past the other people that they're going to piss off on the way.
Right.
That's not what we're seeing. These are little pinpricks here. They're not lines in the sand.
Right.
And I can't help but wonder what does that mean anthropologically, and also in terms of the nettle of modern politics as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I used I think maybe it was just speaking with you. I think earlier in this chat, the word sort of performative. When talking about the sort of act of tearing down a monument. But I think, people are choosing these sites as both as sites of resistance and sort of, rather than creating kind of like a very defined physical border, they're convening around these, as you said, like specific points.
But also in that sense, fairly artificially. That's where we're going to stand, as opposed to this. This has been our generation's long struggle. It for me, again, possibly just as a European or as a Brit, it just doesn't ring true, and so I can't help but wonder, how does that relate to? I mean, what if you weren't who you are and from the US? How would you think about these borders and these moments of violence, because they're happening, so you can't deny that. But what is the next step, almost, I guess?
I think it's sort of unclear, to be honest. I mean, it's hard to completely dissociate from the context of it, because I think so. Sort of tangentially related, like my graduate work was about how you can have a border at a place that's not at a border. You can create a border. You can have sort of sites where border actions take place, right? So I focused on airports. Airports are not necessarily on a physical border, but like when you're inside an airport, you have to cross through a border. So I think in activism in general, people will convene in certain spaces and kind of create a border and create a place of tension and create an area of conflict where you have two different sides. And I think that's what's happening here. And that to me is almost more interesting and more important than the sort of existence of these monuments themselves. Because I think the monuments are sort of a symbol of a place for this sort of action to occur, if that makes sense.
And so I suppose if you were to remove the left-right labels from this stuff, I suppose another similar example would be the Occupy movement, I guess, where people were, in that sense, they are making decisions to turn up at a place and do something. And in that case, often it would be a financial district or something like that.
Right.
So I suppose in that sense, okay, that helps me a little bit.
Yeah.
but it's interesting though to me that there were so many people who were trying to, nonetheless, anchor it to history, anchor it to monuments, and yet actually what's quite quickly revealed when you start to scratch at it is it's not really about that.
It's not about I don't think it's really about the monuments at all.
No. Okay, well now all that remains is for us just to sort out your entire political system. Do you want to do that today, or
we can leave that to another time? I think we've got a lot of people trying to work on that right now.
Yeah. No, I know. Okay, well I think broadly speaking, I think we've expressed a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about over the past couple of weeks, really, haven't we, in this video? Essentially, this is a conversation to a certain extent without end. So, in that sense, I don't think there's any natural place to end it. But is there any sort of final thing that you would say about the, I guess, the anthropology and the history of this sort of thing, and what? Are there any final thoughts? I guess.
I think we've sort of made it pretty clear. Iconoclasm is something that's been happening forever. Civil rights movements, political demonstrations have been happening forever, and I think they will continue to happen. And I find it incredibly interesting, the power of a symbol, the power of a monument, and sort of the role that plays in these kinds of conflicts throughout history. And I think it will be interesting to see sort of what happens with this, what's going on now in America. But yeah, I think we were able to unpack some things and go a little bit further than the kind of like we're destroying history argument, because that just doesn't hold water for me.
No, good. And I think I've certainly I've been fascinated by lots of archaeology, in particular archaeologists and their response, with a slightly blinkered view of what it is that we end up dealing with at the end of the pipeline of history. In so much as like I say, even the pyramids themselves, they haven't got their original surface on them. They've been through the wars, and so. Yeah, I guess I would just leave it there in so much. My final comment really would just be to say that we need to have an appreciation for the fact that this is actually the stuff of history, and out of these frictions, out of the movement of monuments, out of public discussion, consensus, and even actually out of the willful, deliberate attempt to erase something, comes the truth of history. And as I said, I think one of the best examples of that is Akhenaten. So if folks, at some point I might have to make a video about him.
Yeah.
But if folks want to know more about him, just give him a Google. He's a fascinating character, and yet no one now would question the legitimacy of both the attempt to destroy, but also the fact that he still exists. this is history in the making.
Right, like a dismantled Lenin statue tells you a lot more than a
Yeah.
Lenin statue.
Yeah, it does. It does.
The fact that it was dismantled, right? Why was it dismantled? You know, it's just
yeah, and it tells you more. It is no longer in that sense a monolithic monument. It is not a single story.
Mhm.
It is in fact an expression of what happened around it. So yeah, yeah. Let's leave that there. Anyway, it's been a pleasure as ever.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me.
It's fine. It's fine. I suppose what I would say to folks at home is do comment below. Do have a conversation. If you want to have a chat, we will try and engage with you, but keep it civil. And also as well, I'm sorry to say I'm not interested in supporting any extremist views. So if anyone comments anything horrible, it'll be deleted. So just you're forewarned, you're forearmed. Keep the conversation productive. Anyway, guys, as ever, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.
Bye.